My girlfriend dragged me to her company's international client dinner at some upscale steakhouse downtown, where the appetizers cost more than my monthly subway pass. One of those places with mood lighting so dim you can barely read the menu and leather booths that probably cost more than my entire living room set. The kind of restaurant where waiters wear white gloves, and there are more forks at each place setting than any reasonable person could ever need. And she worked at this high-end consulting firm that occupied 3 floors of a glass tower in Midtown, with floor-to-ceiling windows and a reception desk made of Italian marble, and spent the whole ride there in the Uber lecturing me about not embarrassing her in front of the Japanese executives and German investors. They were courting for some massive merger that would make or break her career this quarter, going on and on about how important this was, and how I needed to just smile and nod and not talk too much about my work, because these people were serious business professionals who wouldn't understand freelancing or appreciate my unconventional career path, her perfectly manicured nails tapping anxiously against her phone screen as she rehearsed her talking points. The second we walked through those heavy wooden doors into the restaurant with its marble floors and crystal chandeliers that threw prismatic light across the cream-colored walls and tables, set with pristine white linens, she plastered on this fake smile that didn't reach her eyes, that practiced corporate smile I'd seen her use on difficult clients and demanding bosses, and started introducing me to her coworkers as her boyfriend who works in technical support, which was her way of making my translator certification and my work with international law firms and medical conferences and diplomatic summits sound like I fix printers for a living, or help old ladies reset their email passwords, or troubleshoot Wi-Fi connections in suburban office parks. She actually told her boss right in front of me, while I was standing there holding my coat and trying to look presentable in my one good suit, that I was between real jobs at the moment, even though I'd been successfully freelancing for 3 years and made more than her last quarter when I landed that pharmaceutical contract translating clinical trial documents. But whatever, I wasn't about to argue with her in front of her colleagues who were all giving me these polite but dismissive smiles, like I was some kind of arm candy she'd brought along to fill a seat at the table, their eyes sliding past me to find someone more important to network with. When the international clients arrived in their expensive tailored suits and designer watches and leather shoes that probably cost more than my rent, filing through the entrance with that confident air of people who fly business class and stay in 5-star hotels, she immediately abandoned me at the bar, like I was a coat she'd checked, and rushed over to them, laughing way too loud at everything they said in broken English, while touching the Japanese executive's arm in this overly familiar way that made me wince internally, which anyone who knows anything about Japanese business culture knows is incredibly inappropriate and probably made them uncomfortable, even if they were too polite to show it in that reserved Japanese way. And I could see Mr. Yamaguchi's shoulders tense slightly every time she did it, his smile becoming more strained and formal. I was nursing my whiskey at the bar, watching this whole performance unfold and trying not to cringe at her desperate networking tactics, while the bartender polished glasses and pretended not to notice the social awkwardness playing out, when Mr. Yamaguchi approached the bar and ordered in English with that careful, deliberate pronunciation that told me he was struggling with the language and probably felt self-conscious about it. The way his words came out just a bit too measured and formal, so I asked in perfect Japanese with the proper humble form if he'd prefer sake or shochu, and explained which ones they had available and which regions they came from, and his entire face transformed with relief, like someone had just thrown him a lifeline in rough seas, his posture relaxing and his expression softening into genuine warmth as his eyes lit up with surprised gratitude. We talked for 20 minutes about his daughter studying at Juilliard Music School, and how proud he was of her piano performances, and how she'd chosen Rachmaninoff for her senior recital, and how different and overwhelming New York is from Tokyo, with its constant noise and crowds and aggressive pace, and people who walk too fast and talk too loud, while my girlfriend kept glancing over with this confused expression, like she couldn't understand why he wasn't joining her circle of ass-kissers anymore, or why he seemed so animated and relaxed, talking to the technical support boyfriend she'd been apologizing for all evening, her eyebrows furrowing in that way they did when things weren't going according to her carefully laid plans. Then, one of the German executives, a tall man with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses, overheard me speaking Japanese and almost knocked over his beer when I switched seamlessly to discussing Bundesliga soccer in flawless German with the proper regional accent I'd picked up living in Munich for 2 years during my father's posting there, and suddenly I had 3 Germans roaring with laughter about my spot-on impression of their CEO's thick Bavarian accent and the way he butchered English idioms in meetings, saying things like, We must take the cow by the horns, slapping the bar and wiping tears from their eyes while ordering another round of drinks. The French delegation of 4 people in their perfectly pressed suits and silk ties joined us when they heard me explaining to the bartender in Parisian French, with the proper accent from the 6th arrondissement, that Mr. Yamaguchi couldn't have shellfish due to his allergy, and could they please make sure the kitchen knew to avoid any cross-contamination. And before I knew it, I was essentially running my own United Nations summit at the bar, while my girlfriend's carefully planned schmoozing circle dissolved completely, as one by one the international clients drifted over to where the actual interesting conversation was happening, where people were genuinely connecting instead of performing business theater. The Italian woman in her elegant red dress that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe asked me how I knew so many languages and seemed genuinely curious rather than making small talk to fill awkward silence, her dark eyes sparkling with real interest, and I explained my mother was Brazilian and spoke Portuguese at home while cooking feijoada and listening to bossa nova, and my father was a military brat who dragged us through 12 countries growing up between his various postings from Germany to Japan to Italy to Brazil, so I just absorbed everything like a sponge, picking up languages in playgrounds and markets and schools and from neighbors and friends, which launched us into Portuguese while her husband chimed in with Italian, and I kept up with both simultaneously, while also monitoring the Japanese conversation happening to my left and occasionally translating jokes so everyone could laugh together, the whole group forming this warm, multilingual bubble of actual human connection. My girlfriend appeared at my elbow suddenly with this bright, desperate smile that looked painful plastered across her face, her jaw tight with tension, asking what we were all laughing about in that high-pitched voice she used when she was nervous and trying to maintain control of a situation that was slipping away from her, but nobody switched to English for her, and the German executive actually turned his back on her mid-sentence to ask me about my thoughts on the Berlin tech scene in German, and whether I thought the startup culture there could compete with Silicon Valley, or if Berlin would always be playing catch-up. She kept trying to insert herself into the conversation by laughing when everyone else laughed, even though she had no idea what was being said, and it was obvious to everyone that she was faking it, her laugh coming just a beat too late, and grabbed my arm possessively in a way that was clearly meant to remind everyone that I was with her, when the Italian woman mentioned how refreshing it was to meet someone who understood cultural nuances and proper etiquette instead of just memorizing phrases from language learning apps like Duolingo, and thinking that made them culturally competent enough to navigate international business, giving my girlfriend a pointed look that made it clear she'd noticed the arm-touching debacle earlier and found it distasteful. The Japanese team started discussing their concerns about the merger entirely in Japanese, apparently forgetting anyone from the company was even there, or assuming nobody could understand them in that way people do when they think they're speaking in code, talking about intellectual property concerns, and whether they could trust these Americans who seemed more interested in appearances than substance. And I mentioned casually in Japanese that their fears about IP theft were completely valid, given what my girlfriend's boss had said earlier about aggressive expansion and protecting their own interests at all costs, regardless of what promises they made. And Mr. Yamaguchi went completely silent, staring at me with wide eyes, like I'd just revealed I could read minds, his wine glass frozen halfway to his lips. "Your girlfriend's boss said what exactly?" he asked in English loud enough for everyone at the bar to hear, and for heads to turn from the nearby tables where other diners were cutting into their overpriced steaks, his voice dropping to that dangerous quiet tone that meant someone was about to get destroyed in that polite Japanese way, that's somehow more devastating than outright anger. And I translated the entire conversation I'd overheard in the bathroom earlier, where her boss was bragging on his phone about how they'd lowball the Japanese on the technology transfer once signatures were locked in and the deal was finalized and it was too late for them to back out, explaining their whole strategy of acting friendly and trustworthy until the contracts were signed and then revealing the real terms. The entire bar area went silent, except for the quiet jazz playing over the speakers, and my girlfriend's face drained of all color until she looked almost gray under the dim lighting, as the lead German executive demanded to know in heavily accented English if this was true and whether they'd been wasting their time with people who had no intention of negotiating in good faith, his voice rising with each word, and the French team started packing up their leather briefcases, saying loudly in French that they don't do business with companies that negotiate in bad faith and have no respect for their international partners, their voices carrying across the restaurant and causing other patrons to stare. My girlfriend tried desperately to do damage control, saying I must have misunderstood or taken something out of context, Or maybe my Japanese wasn't as good as I thought it was, her voice getting higher and more desperate. But Mr. Yamaguchi asked her point blank in perfect English if she thought he was stupid enough to fall for that obvious lie when her boyfriend clearly speaks better Japanese than their own professional interpreters they'd brought along who were nodding in agreement with my translation, and his tone was ice cold in that polite way that's somehow more cutting than yelling. Her boss came rushing over from the main dining area to see what the commotion was about, looking confused and increasingly panicked as he took in the scene of his international clients packing up to leave, his face reddening, and the German team started laying into him in rapid English about trust and transparency, and how this was exactly the kind of American corporate behavior that gave international business a bad name, while my girlfriend kept shooting me these venomous looks, like this was somehow my fault for understanding what people say when they assume nobody else in the room can understand them, and having the audacity to be honest about it instead of playing along with whatever game we were supposed to be playing. The dinner ended with both international teams walking out through those heavy wooden doors into the night and refusing to sign anything while calling their lawyers, and my girlfriend's boss turned to me with sweat beading on his forehead and asked if I'd be interested in heading their new international relations division, since I'd just saved them from a potential lawsuit and international scandal, even if this particular deal fell through. And my girlfriend actually laughed this shrill, nervous laugh, saying I wasn't qualified for something like that just because I spoke a few languages, as if that was all there was to it. Mr. Yamaguchi turned to her and said in perfect English that she was everything wrong with American business culture and represented exactly the kind of superficial relationship building that destroyed trust, and that my language skills were worth more than her MBA from whatever prestigious school she'd gone to, because at least I understood that communication isn't just about words, but about respect and cultural understanding and actually giving a damn about the people you're talking to. And then he handed me his business card, saying his company needed a liaison they could trust if I was interested in relocating to Tokyo. Update. I stood there in that dim restaurant holding Mr. Yamaguchi's business card between my fingers, while my girlfriend stared at me with this look of pure rage in her eyes. Her jaw clenched so tight, I could see the muscles twitching. The restaurant suddenly felt way too small and way too quiet, even though there were still other diners sitting at their tables pretending not to watch our drama play out, their forks frozen halfway to their mouths and their eyes darting toward us, then quickly away when they thought we might notice. Her boss had disappeared back toward the main dining room area, muttering frantically into his phone with his hand cupped around his mouth, probably calling his own lawyers or maybe the company's PR team to figure out how to spin this disaster. The remaining restaurant staff moved around us awkwardly, clearing glasses and plates from abandoned tables, their white gloves collecting empty wine bottles, and barely touched appetizers while trying to act like everything was totally normal and they hadn't just witnessed a multi-million-dollar business deal explode right in front of them. My girlfriend grabbed my arm hard enough that her fingernails dug into my skin through my suit jacket and hissed that we needed to leave immediately, her voice this tight whisper that somehow felt louder than if she'd been shouting. Her perfectly applied makeup was starting to crack around her eyes, where tiny lines appeared in the foundation, and I could see a muscle jumping in her cheek as she tried to keep smiling for anyone who might still be watching. We walked through those heavy wooden doors out into the cold night air, and the second we hit the sidewalk, she immediately started screaming at me about how I just destroyed her entire career and embarrassed her in front of everyone who actually matters in her professional life. She was yelling so loud that people walking past on the street turned to stare at us, this well-dressed couple having a massive fight right there on the corner, outside an expensive restaurant. And a taxi driver slowed down like he thought we might need a ride, but then sped up again when he saw her face. I told her as calmly as I could manage that I didn't actually destroy anything, that her boss did that all by himself when he planned to cheat their international partners and treat them like idiots who wouldn't notice getting screwed over. She actually laughed at that, this bitter, harsh sound that came from somewhere deep in her throat, and said, "I clearly don't understand how real business actually works in the real world." She said I was naive and idealistic, and that's exactly why I'll never have a real career, just my little freelance translator gigs that barely pay my rent each month, and certainly don't impress anyone at networking events or dinner parties. She was pacing back and forth on the sidewalk now, her heels clicking against the concrete, and her breath came out in these white puffs in the cold air, while she gestured wildly with her hands. She said that everyone cuts corners and makes promises they don't plan to keep. That's just how business works. When you're dealing with millions of dollars and international contracts, and I was being childish thinking that honesty and cultural respect mattered more than closing deals and making money. Something shifted inside me hearing her say all that, like a lock clicking open in my brain, and I suddenly realized with this crystal clear certainty that she had never actually respected what I do or who I am as a person. She just tolerated me, as long as I stayed quiet and small and didn't interfere with her ambitions or make waves at her corporate events. I looked at her standing there in her expensive dress and her perfect hair and her designer shoes, and I told her we were done, just like that, 2 words that felt both terrifying and liberating at the same time. I turned and started walking toward the subway entrance half a block away, and she followed me for a bit, yelling about how I was throwing away our entire relationship over some stupid moral stand that wouldn't matter to anyone in a week. She kept saying I was being dramatic and making a huge mistake, and I'd regret this when I was still living in my tiny apartment in 5 years while she was making partner at her firm. She finally stopped following me when I reached the top of the subway stairs, and I heard her heels clicking away in the opposite direction, getting quieter and quieter until they disappeared completely. She was probably calling an Uber to take her back to her expensive apartment in that luxury building with the doorman and the marble lobby, the place where I'd never felt comfortable anyway, because everything was so white and perfect and sterile. I rode the subway home to my modest place in Queens, sitting on the hard plastic seat and holding both business cards in my hand, Mr. Yamaguchi's with its elegant Japanese characters and her boss's with its raised lettering and corporate logo. The subway car rattled and swayed through the tunnels while other passengers dozed or stared at their phones, and I kept looking down at those 2 small rectangles of cardstock that somehow represented 2 completely different possible futures for my life. I spent the entire night sitting on my old couch that I'd bought from a thrift store 3 years ago, just staring at both business cards spread out on my coffee table and thinking hard about what each one actually meant for my future. Tokyo meant starting completely over in a city I genuinely loved, but leaving behind everything familiar, all my freelance clients and my apartment and the few friends I had in New York and my mom who I video chatted with every Sunday morning. The consulting firm meant staying right here in New York in my same apartment with my same routine, but working for people whose business practices I had just publicly destroyed and whose ethics I fundamentally disagreed with on every level. I kept picking up one card and then the other, feeling the weight of them in my hand like they were made of lead instead of paper, and watching the streetlight outside my window cast shadows across my living room walls as cars drove past. Around 3 in the morning, when my eyes felt gritty and my brain felt foggy from exhaustion and too much thinking, I finally admitted to myself that I couldn't possibly work for my girlfriend's boss. Not after what I'd overheard in that bathroom with him bragging on his phone about screwing over the Japanese clients, and definitely not after watching him try to manipulate international partners who trusted him and believed his promises about fair dealing and mutual respect. I opened my laptop right there on my couch and sent him a polite email declining his offer, explaining that I didn't think we would be a good cultural fit for each other, which felt like the biggest understatement I'd ever written in my entire life. I hit send before I could second-guess myself, and then closed the laptop and finally went to bed as the sky outside started turning that pale gray color that comes right before sunrise. The next morning, I woke up to my phone buzzing like crazy on my nightstand, and when I picked it up, I saw 17 missed calls from my now ex-girlfriend and a voicemail notification. I listened to the message while making coffee in my tiny kitchen, and her voice came through the speaker crying, and shaky, saying that her boss was blaming her for bringing me to the dinner and she might actually lose her job over this whole mess. Part of me felt genuinely bad for her because I knew how much she'd worked to build her career and how important that job was to her sense of identity and self-worth. But a much bigger part of me remembered exactly how she'd introduced me to everyone as someone who works in technical support and is currently between real jobs, like my 3 years of successful freelancing and my work with international law firms and medical conferences didn't count as an actual career worth mentioning or being proud of. I opened my email and wrote to Mr. Yamaguchi, thanking him sincerely for his generous offer and asking if we could possibly set up a video call to discuss the Tokyo position in more detail. I tried to sound professional and interested without seeming too desperate, even though my hands were shaking slightly as I typed, because this felt like such a huge decision that could change my entire life. He responded within an hour, even though it must have been the middle of the night in Japan with the time difference, saying he was genuinely impressed by my quick decision-making, and suggesting we talk the following week after he returned to Japan and had a chance to settle back into his office. His email was warm and encouraging, and he mentioned that his company valued people who could make difficult ethical choices even when it cost them personally, which made me feel like maybe I'd done the right thing, even though everything felt chaotic and uncertain. My ex-girlfriend showed up at my apartment that evening without calling first, or texting to warn me she was coming, just pounding on my door until I opened it. She looked completely exhausted with dark circles under her eyes, and her hair pulled back in a messy way that was totally unlike her usual perfect appearance, and she was wearing jeans and a sweatshirt instead of her normal work clothes. She pushed past me into my apartment, demanding to know if I was really seriously going to move all the way to Tokyo and just leave her here to deal with all the fallout from the dinner completely alone. I reminded her as gently as I could that we had broken up the night before on the sidewalk outside the restaurant, and that the fallout she was dealing with came from her boss's unethical business practices and his plan to cheat international partners, not from my decision to be honest about what I'd overheard. She stood in my living room looking around at my modest furniture and my overflowing bookshelves, and my kitchen that was barely big enough for one person, and I could see her processing everything that had happened, and maybe starting to understand that we'd wanted completely different things from life all along. She collapsed onto my couch suddenly, like all the energy just drained out of her body, and started crying these big, ugly sobs that made her shoulders shake and her mascara run down her face in black streaks. She kept saying over and over between gasps that she worked so hard to build her career, and now it was all falling apart because I couldn't just keep my mouth shut and let the adults handle business like a normal, supportive boyfriend would have done. I stood there in my tiny living room watching her fall apart and feeling this hot flash of anger rise up in my chest, hearing her talk about speaking 5 languages and understanding cultural differences like it was some kind of character flaw I should have kept hidden instead of a valuable skill that literally saved those Japanese executives from getting screwed over. She looked up at me with her face all red and blotchy and said I didn't understand how the real world worked and how sometimes you had to play the game and make compromises to get ahead. I told her quietly that I understood perfectly well, and that was exactly why we could never work, because she saw honesty and integrity as weaknesses, while I saw them as the only things worth having. She grabbed her purse and her coat and stormed out of my apartment, slamming the door so hard that my neighbor's dog started barking through the wall, and I heard her heels clicking fast down the hallway toward the elevator. I stood there for a minute just breathing and looking around my modest apartment with its secondhand furniture and overflowing bookshelves and realizing that I felt lighter somehow, like I'd been carrying around something heavy for months without noticing the weight until it was finally gone. After she left, I opened my laptop and started searching Tokyo neighborhoods and apartment listings and cost of living calculators. I found myself getting more and more excited looking at photos of narrow streets with vending machines on every corner and tiny restaurants with plastic food displays in the windows and parks with cherry blossom trees. The rent was actually cheaper than New York for a decent place, and I started making lists of what I'd need to bring and what I could buy there and how much money I'd need saved up for the first few months. I called my mom in Brazil around midnight, which was early morning there, and told her everything that happened at the dinner and about the breakup and about the job offer in Tokyo. She laughed this warm, familiar laugh and said in Portuguese that she always knew that girlfriend was wrong for me, because in 2 years, she never once asked about our family or showed any interest in where I came from or wanted to learn even basic Portuguese phrases to talk to my relatives. My mom said she could hear in my voice that I was already gone in my head and that Tokyo was calling me, and I should listen to that call because opportunities like this don't come around twice in a lifetime. The video call with Yamaguchi happened 3 days later after I sent him a formal email expressing my serious interest in the position. He appeared on my laptop screen sitting in what looked like a traditional office with wooden furniture, and I could see Tokyo buildings through the window behind him. He explained in a mix of English and Japanese that his company was expanding their American operations, but kept running into cultural problems where both sides thought they were communicating clearly, but actually completely misunderstood each other's intentions and expectations. He said they needed someone who could bridge those gaps and translate not just words, but entire ways of thinking about business and relationships and trust. He told me what impressed him most at that dinner wasn't just my language skills, but my instinct to protect his team from being exploited, even though it cost me personally. He said that kind of integrity was exactly what they valued in their corporate culture, and it was rare to find someone who combined linguistic with genuine cultural understanding and moral courage. I felt my face getting warm hearing him describe me that way, because nobody had ever talked about my skills like they were actually valuable and important, instead of just some weird, quirky thing I happened to be able to do. He offered me a salary that was almost double what I made freelancing last year, plus full relocation assistance and help finding an apartment in Tokyo and health insurance, and all these benefits I'd never had as a freelancer. The number he mentioned made me blink and check that I'd heard him correctly, because it seemed almost too good to be true. I asked for 2 days to think about it, even though I already knew my answer, because this felt too big and life-changing to decide right there on a video call without at least pretending to consider it carefully. He smiled and said he understood completely, and that big decisions deserved proper consideration, and he'd wait to hear from me. After we hung up, I just sat there staring at my laptop screen for a long time, thinking about how my whole life was about to change in ways I couldn't even fully imagine yet. I spent those 2 days walking around New York, visiting all my favorite spots like the park where I used to practice languages with international students, and the coffee shop where I did most of my freelance work, and the dumpling place in Chinatown where the owner always spoke to me in Mandarin. I walked through Times Square with all its crazy lights and noise and tourists taking selfies and realized I didn't feel connected to this city anymore. I'd been living small here, taking whatever freelance work came along and dating someone who made me feel like I should apologize for my background and my abilities. Tokyo represented something completely different. It meant choosing myself and my skills instead of shrinking down to fit someone else's narrow vision of who I should be. It meant working somewhere that actually valued what I brought to the table instead of tolerating it. I sat on a bench in Central Park, watching people jog past and families having picnics, and couples holding hands, and understood that staying in New York meant staying small and safe, while Tokyo meant taking a risk on becoming whoever I was actually supposed to be. I sent Yamaguchi an email accepting his offer and thanking him for believing in me and for giving me this incredible opportunity. He responded within an hour, saying he was happy and excited to have me join the team and that their legal department would contact me about visa paperwork and that he'd personally help me find a good apartment in a neighborhood I'd like. My ex found out through mutual friends, apparently, and sent me this long text message saying I was running away and making a huge mistake, and that I'd regret leaving New York and throwing away our relationship, and that Tokyo was just me being dramatic and trying to prove some point that nobody cared about. I read the whole thing twice, and then deleted it without responding, because I was completely done explaining myself to people who never valued me in the first place. Her words just bounced off me like they didn't even matter anymore, because I knew with total certainty that I was making the right choice for the first time in years. 3 weeks later, I was sitting on a plane to Tokyo with 2 suitcases and my laptop, and this mix of terror and excitement that made my hands shake and my stomach flip. Everything I owned that mattered fit into those 2 suitcases, and everything else I'd either sold or given away or left in storage at my mom's place in Brazil. The plane took off from JFK, and I watched New York get smaller and smaller below me until it disappeared into clouds, and I felt like I was literally flying away from my old life into something completely unknown. Yamaguchi had arranged for someone from the company to meet me at Narita Airport and help me get to my new apartment in Shibuya, which he'd found for me, and which I'd only seen in photos. I tried to sleep on the 14-hour flight, but mostly just watched movies, and thought about what my new life would look like and whether I'd made the right decision and whether I could actually do this job they were paying me so much money to do. My first month in Tokyo was overwhelming in the best possible way, with intensive training about the company's business practices and expectations and values. I spent long days in conference rooms learning about their corporate structure and their major clients and their expansion plans and their specific cultural protocols. I met the team I'd be working with, and they were genuinely excited to have someone who could help them navigate American business culture without losing their own identity in the process. They asked me tons of questions about American communication styles and business expectations and what things meant when Americans said them versus what they literally said. I started to understand that my job wasn't just translating words, but helping both sides understand the invisible rules and assumptions and values that shaped how they approached everything from negotiations to email etiquette to meeting structures. I started building relationships with the American partners and clients the company worked with and realized I was actually good at this work in a way I never was, just taking random freelance translation jobs. Being able to explain not just what people were saying, but why they were saying it and what cultural context mattered made me valuable in ways my ex never understood or appreciated. I could tell an American client that when the Japanese team said they needed to discuss something internally, it meant they had serious concerns that needed addressing, not that they were just being slow or bureaucratic. I could tell the Japanese team that when Americans pushed for quick decisions, it came from their cultural value of efficiency, not from disrespect or impatience. I was building bridges between completely different ways of seeing the world, and it felt important and meaningful in ways my freelance work never had. Yamaguchi became this unexpected mentor, taking me to business dinners and teaching me the subtle aspects of Japanese corporate culture that you can't learn from textbooks or language apps. He showed me how to read the room during negotiations and how to understand what people weren't saying and how to navigate the complex web of obligations and relationships that shaped every business interaction. He told me about his daughter's progress at Juilliard and how she'd nailed her Rachmaninoff piece and gotten accepted into a prestigious summer program, and I shared updates about my mom in Brazil and her plans to visit Tokyo. It felt like the kind of genuine relationship I never had with my ex's corporate contacts, who only cared about what you could do for their careers and their networks and their advancement up the ladder. 4 months passed, and I found myself sitting at the head of a conference table in our Tokyo office, leading my first major negotiation team, working with a Japanese manufacturing company that wanted to expand their operations into the American market, and needed someone who could help them understand not just the language, but the entire way Americans approach business relationships and contracts and expectations. The team was made up of 5 Japanese executives who'd been with the company for decades and 2 American consultants who'd flown in from California. And I spent the first 3 hours of our meeting translating not just words, but entire concepts about how each side thought about timelines and decision-making and what constituted a binding agreement versus a preliminary discussion. I explained to the American side that when the Japanese team said they needed to take something back to their senior management for consideration, it wasn't a stalling tactic or bureaucratic delay, but a fundamental part of their decision-making process that showed respect for organizational hierarchy. And I explained to the Japanese side that when the Americans pushed for quick preliminary agreements, it came from their cultural value of momentum and progress rather than from any disrespect or desire to rush into bad decisions. By the end of that first day, both sides were actually listening to each other instead of just waiting for their turn to talk. And the lead Japanese executive pulled me aside after everyone else left and thanked me for helping them avoid what could have been a disaster of misunderstanding and mistrust. Walking back to my apartment that evening through the crowded Shibuya streets, with their neon signs and vending machines and tiny restaurants, I felt this deep satisfaction knowing that everything I'd learned growing up bouncing between countries and absorbing different languages and cultural rules suddenly made complete sense as an actual career path, instead of just some weird, quirky background that made me hard to categorize on job applications. The next morning, I woke up to an email notification on my phone and saw my ex-girlfriend's name in my inbox, which made my stomach clench for a second before I even opened it. She'd sent a long message explaining that she'd left the consulting firm about 2 months ago after everything fell apart with the international merger, and the firm basically blamed her for the whole disaster, even though her boss was the one who'd planned to cheat the Japanese clients. And she'd taken a job at a much smaller company doing project management work that paid less, but didn't make her feel like she was selling her soul every single day. She wrote that she'd been doing a lot of thinking about how badly she'd treated me and how she'd been so focused on climbing the corporate ladder and impressing the right people that she couldn't see how her ambition was turning her into someone she didn't actually like very much. Someone who cared more about appearances and titles than about being a decent person who treated others with basic respect. She said watching everything fall apart at that dinner had forced her to really look at herself and her priorities, and she'd realized she'd been wrong about basically everything. Wrong about what mattered in a career, and wrong about how she'd treated me, and wrong about thinking that success meant having the right job title and the right apartment in the right neighborhood. The email went on for several paragraphs and ended with her saying she wanted to apologize sincerely for making me feel small, and for being embarrassed by my work instead of being proud of what I could do, and she hoped I was doing well in Tokyo, and that maybe someday we could talk again as friends who'd learned important lessons from each other. I sat there in my small apartment kitchen drinking my morning coffee and reading through her email 3 times, feeling this complicated mix of emotions that was hard to sort through. Part of me felt genuinely glad that she'd figured some things out and was in a better place mentally and professionally, because nobody deserves to be miserable even if they treated you badly in the past. But a much bigger part of me recognized that we'd wanted completely different things from life all along, and that her apology, while probably sincere, didn't actually change the fundamental incompatibility between us, or erase the months of feeling like I had to apologize for who I was just to make her comfortable around her corporate friends. I spent about an hour composing a response email, deleting it, starting over, deleting that one too, until I finally wrote something short and honest that felt right. I told her I appreciated her apology, and I was genuinely glad she'd left a job that was making her unhappy, and found something better that aligned more with her actual values instead of just her ambitions. But I didn't think we should stay in touch or try to maintain some kind of friendship, because we wanted fundamentally different things from life and from relationships, and it was better to make a clean break than to leave things messy and unresolved with awkward occasional emails that didn't really go anywhere meaningful. I hit send before I could second-guess myself and felt this sense of relief wash over me, like I'd finally set a clear boundary and closed a chapter that needed to be closed instead of leaving it hanging open indefinitely. 3 weeks later, my mom flew in from Brazil for a 2-week visit, and I took time off work to show her around Tokyo, though she insisted on exploring neighborhoods by herself during the days. While I was at the office because she wanted to experience the city on her own terms, without me hovering over her like a tour guide. She'd spend her mornings riding the subway to different areas and walking through markets and parks and shopping districts, taking photos of everything from vending machines to tiny shrines tucked between buildings to old women selling flowers on street corners. And then she'd come back to my apartment in the evenings and cook Brazilian food in my tiny kitchen while telling me about everything she'd seen and everyone she'd tried to talk to, using her handful of Japanese phrases and a lot of hand gestures. She made feijoada one night, filling my whole apartment with the smell of black beans and pork and spices, and we sat on my floor eating it, while she told me about finding a Brazilian grocery store in a neighborhood I'd never even visited and having a long conversation in Portuguese with the owner who'd been living in Tokyo for 15 years. On her last evening before flying back, she looked at me seriously across my small kitchen table and said in Portuguese that I seemed happier and more confident than I'd been in years, that there was something different about the way I carried myself and talked about my work and my life here. She said she was proud of me for choosing the harder path of moving halfway across the world and starting over completely instead of staying in New York in a relationship, and a situation that was making me smaller and quieter and less like myself, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is recognize your own worth and refuse to accept less than you deserve. About a month after my mom left, I met someone at a work event, a Japanese woman named Yuki, who worked in the marketing department and had been with the company for about 3 years. We ended up sitting next to each other at a presentation about expanding into Southeast Asian markets, and she made this funny, quiet comment in Japanese about how the presenter kept using English business terms incorrectly. And I laughed and responded in Japanese, and then we switched to English when she mentioned she'd studied in Australia for 2 years and also spoke decent Mandarin from working with Chinese clients. After the presentation ended, we grabbed coffee in the building's cafe and talked for almost 2 hours about languages and travel and what it was like being the person in your office who could actually communicate across cultures instead of just knowing enough phrases to order food or ask for directions. Our first actual date happened the following week at a small restaurant in Shimokitazawa, and the whole evening was this easy, natural conversation, switching back and forth between Japanese and English, depending on what we were talking about and what felt more natural for expressing certain ideas. She asked me about my work and actually seemed genuinely interested instead of trying to figure out how impressive it sounded or what it said about my career trajectory. And when I told her about the dinner disaster in New York that had led to me moving here, she laughed and said it sounded like the universe had done me a favor by blowing up a situation that was never going to work out anyway. Walking her home after dinner, I felt this refreshing sense of being with someone who saw my language abilities and cultural knowledge as interesting parts of who I was, rather than something weird or inconvenient that needed to be downplayed or apologized for in certain social situations. 6 months into my Tokyo job, Mr. Yamaguchi called me into his office on a Friday afternoon, and I walked in expecting another project assignment or maybe feedback on the manufacturing negotiation I'd just wrapped up. Instead, he told me he was promoting me to senior liaison with a significant raise and much more responsibility for managing major client relationships, particularly the complex ones involving multiple countries and cultural contexts that required someone who could navigate all the subtle communication challenges that came up. He said in his formal but warm way that I'd exceeded every expectation they'd had when they hired me, and proven that cultural intelligence and genuine respect for different ways of doing business mattered far more than having an MBA from some prestigious school or knowing all the trendy business buzzwords that consultants like to throw around in meetings. He mentioned that several clients had specifically requested to work with me on their projects because they trusted me to understand not just what they were saying, but what they actually meant and what cultural values were driving their concerns and expectations. Sitting there in his office looking out at the Tokyo skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I felt this deep sense of validation for every choice I'd made, every risk I'd taken, every moment I'd chosen to be honest about what I knew instead of staying quiet to make other people comfortable. That evening, I video chatted with my mom from my apartment, and she could immediately tell something good had happened from the look on my face. I told her about the promotion and the raise and the new responsibilities, and she started crying those happy, proud mom tears while saying she always knew I'd find my place eventually. She asked me in Portuguese if I had any regrets about leaving New York and ending my relationship and starting completely over in a foreign country, and I thought about it honestly before answering. I told her the only thing I regretted was not recognizing my own worth sooner and staying too long with someone who made me feel like I needed to apologize for being who I was, that I wished I'd had the confidence to walk away earlier instead of trying to make myself smaller and quieter to fit into someone else's narrow vision of what an acceptable boyfriend should be. She nodded and said that sometimes we need to go through difficult experiences to learn what we won't accept anymore, and that the important thing wasn't when I learned the lesson, but that I actually learned it and acted on it instead of just understanding it intellectually while staying in the same bad situation. 3 months into dating Yuki, we were having dinner at her apartment when she said something that stuck with me for days afterward. She told me she really liked that I was confident about who I was and where I came from and what I could do, instead of trying to fit myself into some standard corporate mold or downplay my abilities to make other people feel more comfortable around me. She said it was actually pretty rare to meet someone who was genuinely comfortable being different and who saw their unconventional background as an advantage rather than something to overcome or hide, and that confidence was way more attractive than any job title or salary could ever be. Her words made me realize how much energy I'd wasted during my relationship with my ex, trying to be acceptable and appropriate and not too weird or too different, constantly monitoring myself and holding back parts of who I was to avoid embarrassing her or making her corporate friends uncomfortable. With Yuki, I could just be myself completely without any of that exhausting self-monitoring, and the difference in how that felt was huge. The company sent me back to New York for a week-long business trip about a month later to meet with potential American partners and help set up some preliminary discussions about collaboration opportunities. I arranged to have coffee with a few old friends I hadn't seen since moving to Tokyo, and every single one of them commented on how different I seemed now, more relaxed and sure of myself and comfortable in my own skin. One friend I'd known since college said I used to have this tense quality, like I was always waiting for criticism or judgment, and now I seemed genuinely at ease in a way he'd never seen before. Walking through Manhattan after those coffee meetings, past the familiar streets and subway stops and buildings I used to see every day, I realized I didn't miss the city the way I thought I would. I'd built a whole life in New York for years and expected to feel some deep nostalgia or longing being back, but mostly, I just felt like I was visiting somewhere I used to live rather than coming home. I'd never really been fully myself here because I'd been too busy trying to fit into someone else's expectations and make my unconventional background seem more normal and acceptable. On my last day in New York before flying back to Tokyo, I stopped at a coffee shop in Manhattan to grab something before heading to the airport, and I literally ran straight into my ex-girlfriend coming out the door as I was going in. We both froze for a second with that awkward recognition, and then she suggested we sit down for a few minutes since we were both already there. She looked different somehow, less polished and corporate, wearing jeans and a casual sweater instead of the designer work clothes she used to favor. She told me she was engaged to someone from her new company, a guy who worked in operations and apparently didn't care about climbing any corporate ladders or impressing the right people at networking events. She said she'd learned a lot from how badly things ended between us, and she was trying really hard to be less focused on appearances and status, and more on building genuine connections with people who actually mattered to her. I told her I was genuinely happy for her, and hoped her engagement worked out well, and I meant it because I didn't carry any anger or resentment anymore, just this distant sense that we'd both been wrong for each other. And it was good that we'd figured that out before wasting more years trying to make something work that was never going to. We talked for maybe 20 minutes about safe, neutral topics before I had to leave for the airport, and walking away from that coffee shop, I felt this complete sense of closure, like that chapter of my life was finally and fully finished, and I could move forward without any lingering loose ends or unresolved feelings pulling me backward. Back in Tokyo, I found myself leading the biggest deal of my career, working with a major Japanese tech company that wanted to partner with an American firm on some new software development project. I spent weeks shuttling between conference rooms, helping both sides actually understand each other, instead of just nodding politely while completely missing the point. The American team kept pushing for quick decisions and aggressive timelines, while the Japanese team needed time to build trust and make sure everyone was aligned before moving forward. I explained to the Americans that rushing things would actually slow everything down because the Japanese side would interpret it as disrespect and pull back, and I explained to the Japanese team that the American urgency came from their business culture valuing momentum and wasn't meant as pressure or disrespect. Everything I learned from that disaster dinner came into play as I helped both sides see past the surface words to understand what cultural values were really driving each position and concern. The deal finally closed after 3 months of careful negotiation, and both companies sent formal letters to our office, specifically mentioning my cultural liaison work as essential to making the partnership happen. Yamaguchi took me out to this incredibly expensive restaurant in Ginza to celebrate, one of those places where they serve tiny, perfect portions of food that probably cost more per bite than most people's entire meals. He told me over sake that he knew from our first conversation at that bar in New York that I had something special, this ability to make people from completely different backgrounds feel genuinely understood and respected, instead of just tolerated or managed. He said most translators just convert words, but I translated entire ways of thinking, and that made all the difference in building real trust between companies. A year after moving to Tokyo, I was completely fluent in business Japanese, not just the language, but all the subtle ways of expressing things that textbooks never teach you. I'd built this reputation in the company as the person who could handle the most complicated international negotiations, the ones where cultural misunderstandings could blow up million-dollar deals in seconds. I'd helped close deals worth more money than I ever imagined touching in my entire life, and my salary had grown to the point where I could actually save money each month instead of just barely covering rent and expenses like I did in New York. The work felt meaningful in ways my random freelance translation jobs never did, because I wasn't just converting words between languages. I was building actual bridges between people who genuinely wanted to work together, but kept accidentally offending each other without realizing it. Yuki and I moved in together into a bigger apartment in a quieter neighborhood, away from the chaos of Shibuya, a place with actual rooms instead of just one space for everything. Unpacking boxes together and deciding where furniture should go, I realized this was what a healthy relationship actually felt like, when both people respected each other's work and supported each other's growth instead of competing or keeping score of who was more successful. She got promoted to senior marketing manager and came home excited to tell me about it, and I felt genuinely happy for her success instead of threatened by it or worried about how it made me look in comparison. We'd cook dinner together in our actual kitchen that had counter space and talk about our days in this mix of Japanese and English, switching languages mid-sentence depending on what felt more natural for expressing certain ideas. 6 months later, I got invited to speak at an international business conference in Singapore about cultural intelligence in global negotiations. Standing on that stage in front of hundreds of business professionals, sharing what I'd learned felt completely surreal compared to where I was 2 years ago. Sitting at that bar in New York, feeling small and apologetic about my unconventional career path. I talked about that dinner where everything changed and how choosing honesty over convenience opened doors I didn't even know existed. And afterward, at least a dozen people approached me with business cards asking about consulting opportunities for their own companies. Flying back to Tokyo, I kept thinking about how different my life looked now, working in a job that valued exactly who I was, instead of asking me to hide parts of myself to make other people comfortable. Getting dragged to that corporate dinner ended up being the best thing that could have happened, even though it felt terrible watching my relationship explode in front of everyone. I found work that actually used my skills instead of tolerating them, a relationship built on mutual respect instead of one person feeling embarrassed by the other, and a life in Tokyo that felt real in ways New York never did. The worst nights sometimes lead to the best changes when you have the guts to speak up, even when it costs you everything familiar.